This map shows the Strait of Hormuz, a 33-kilometer stretch of water between Iran and Oman. It is the corridor for roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil, but the actual shipping lanes inside it are just 3 kilometers wide, one lane going in, one lane coming out. On February 28, 2026, coordinated surprise airstrikes by the US and Israel assassinated Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and several senior officials. In immediate retaliation, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps flooded the strait with sea mines, armed speedboats, and boarding parties. Daily ship transits crashed from over 130 to fewer than 10. By cutting off a geographic artery narrow enough to drive across in minutes, military forces weaponized a physical bottleneck to halt the global energy market. India imports up to 90% of its crude oil, with half historically traveling through this single corridor. But unlike Japan, which holds 254 days of emergency crude coverage, India's strategic petroleum reserve holds enough for roughly 9 days. Within weeks of the strait's closure in early March, the price of the Indian crude basket surged from $69 a barrel to $126. With ships unable to pass and a reserve tank that would empty in under 2 weeks, the government began monitoring fuel stocks 24/7 to manage the risk of a total shortage. In Visakhapatnam, Bhargavi Suresh sits quietly, cleaning the glass of her husband's framed photograph. Patnala Suresh was an Indian seafarer killed on March 1st when the tanker Skylight was attacked near the strait. She is left to raise 2 young sons alone. India is one of the top 3 global suppliers of maritime labor. The instant the blockade began, a workforce of over 300,000 Indian seafarers found themselves navigating an active war zone. Tithi Chiranjeevi was stranded for over a month on the ship Ilda near Iran's Khorramshahr port. He survived dozens of nightly missile explosions before making a 15-day overland journey through Iraq and Armenia to reach home. The economic data reflects the rising cost of fuel, but it does not account for the thousands of Indian citizens physically stranded on the front lines of a foreign conflict. By mid-March, global oil prices had spiked nearly 130%. The shipping lanes remained mined, and thousands of sailors were trapped at sea. Yet at the retail level, an anomaly appeared. While global consumer fuel prices rose by 25 to 30%, Indian petrol prices at the pump initially increased by roughly 7%. To achieve this, the Indian government intervened directly, slashing the excise tax on diesel down to 0 to cap the cost for consumers. That decision meant the government was sacrificing $1.18 billion in tax revenue every single month. The pumps stayed open because the state absorbed the financial hit, shielding the public from the immediate impact of the price collapse. In Washington, the Trump administration launched a full aerial campaign against Iranian naval targets and publicly threatened to destroy Iran's domestic infrastructure if the strait was not reopened. Diplomatic pressure eventually yielded the April Islamabad talks. Mediated by Pakistan, the negotiations produced a 2-week ceasefire, and the strait technically reopened. But the reopening was conditional. Iran's military maintained de facto control by requiring every commercial vessel to coordinate its passage directly with their armed forces. By July, the agreement dissolved completely. The U.S. resumed heavy aerial bombardments for 13 consecutive days and imposed a naval blockade that cost Iranian ports an estimated $500 million a day. The failure of the talks demonstrated that even with a negotiated opening, the physical transit of oil remained dependent on the immediate military situation on the ground. On July 24th, Houthi rebels in Yemen launched their own maritime blockade against Saudi-linked ships in the Red Sea. This secondary blockade effectively removed India's main alternative shipping route, which locked trade between 2 simultaneous choke points. Under this pressure, a paradox emerged. During the first quarter of the crisis, the actual volume of oil India imported dropped by 4.5%. But despite buying less oil, India's total import bills surged 60%, hitting $49.8 billion in 3 months. A decade-long effort to diversify oil suppliers across 40 different countries was neutralized in weeks, because the cost of routing cargo around 2 active war zones was higher than the budget could sustain. RBI Governor Sanjay Malhotra recently warned that the fiscal shield is reaching its limit. If the crisis continues, Analysts expect a pump price hike of 8 to 15 rupees per liter. The broader economic damage is spreading. Foreign investors have pulled over $20 billion out of Indian equities. GDP growth forecasts have been cut to 6.7%, and food inflation is expected to double. Out on the water, thousands of commercial vessels remain at anchor. At least 6,000 seafarers are currently stranded on over 400 vessels, waiting for diplomatic channels that remain frozen. A 33-kilometer stretch of water demonstrated the power to disrupt national budgets and leave thousands of families waiting for sailors who cannot find their way home.